Hello everyone, Mike Levin, Sunday, May 8th, 2022, around 7:30 p.m. on my way to Staten Island, pick up the kid. It's going to be a Sunday through Monday weekend this week because Mother's Day. And maybe I'll call in sick tomorrow or mental health day or whatever because I want to spend some time with the kid. I have the electric bike canoe combination, which opens up the Delaware River to me, and I'm very pumped about it. Just fully charged the bike in anticipation for that maiden voyage. And the light is beautiful, so I figured I'd start the video right away before I actually got out onto the highway and think about what to talk about. Wow. On the personal front, on the professional front, maybe someday I share with you folks, but today is not the day. Mikey's life is stranger than fiction, let me tell you. So, I've been sitting on a number of projects for many years, let's say the better part of a decade and a half. In fact, they're projects that have been implemented in the past, partially implemented, implemented for employers in different ways, but never implemented for myself using the current state of affairs, which is, it's always improving. Stuff that used to be, shall we say, a lot of technical work, a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of technical liability, running databases, running a lot of local software, running a lot of web server software, is all just kind of fading away in what I would call a best case scenario. These types of things, right, the cloud is helping a lot. And when things are cloud, you're talking Amazon or Google or Microsoft, right? It's either, Uncle Google or Uncle Microsoft or Uncle Amazon, right? The three big bros of tech. And they got some decent cloud services. I guess Elon is not in the cloud business yet, right? Hey, he ought to get it. He started on it. I think I might have even considered going to work for one of his early companies, Zip2, something like that. Boy, how life changes on these tiny little decisions. But I had my brush with that kind of, miraculous connections. I'm good having my own identity in myself for my own reasons now. I had enough years connecting my identity to Commodore computers. And on reflection over the years, the single thing that has served me best, right? It's really tough because, regrets, how things coulda, shoulda, woulda been. But honestly, I probably would not have taken up Unix and Linux so easily, so naturally, so readily, were it not for, drumroll please, the Amiga, of course, the Amiga computer from Commodore. Commodore, marketed the Amiga, continued developing the Amiga. But the Amiga computer comes from the rise of the home gaming industry, the Atari 2600, or VCS for the non-United States audience. And it's what brought, all those classics into our home, the classic video games of the olden days. First there was things like Pong, and then there was the Atari 2600, and it did graphics at a really low price, cartridge-based system. And the hardware engineer who designed those chips also designed the Amiga. Now, he didn't do the software, but he set the stage for it to support some really cool Unix-like software. There's some different levels to that software. Hard to get it exactly right, but at the lower level, there was Kickstart at the really lowest level, the intimate knowledge of the hardware to get the thing kick-started, get it starting to boot. Then there was Workbench, which put on the graphical user operating system, but somewhere in between there was Amiga DOS and the Amiga shell. So just like in Unix, where there's a raw Unix shell, but no one really uses it, it's not even a shell, right? The shell is what you put over the command. There's a raw command line interface, CLI. The term CLI is becoming popular again, I think mostly because of the Vue framework. Vue.js uses the term CLI a lot, and given its popularity, people know what a CLI is again, the command line interface. That's what we called it on the Amiga. But few people actually ever really use the raw operating system provided command line interface. It doesn't have things like command line history when you hit the up and the down arrows. You get those extra features by layering a shell over top of the command line interface. So Amiga DOS had a shell, layered on top of it that gave it a lot of very Unix-like features, like the command line history with the arrows. But beside that, it already was a very Unix-like command line interface, particularly the syntax, using the forward slashes instead of the backslashes, having very Unix-like bash scripts. The whole system started up with something called the startup sequence. Things were called what they were. And you could do that on Unix. If you wanted a file called startup sequence to start your system, it could. It's just by convention, things have different file names. But the basic premise of how it all worked was the same. Even piping the output of one program on the command line interface could be sent into the input, the standard in, and standard out. So the standard out of one command, like echo something, could be sent to the standard in of another program like SED, the streaming editor. And you could do all kinds of interesting tricks by chaining up these commands to each other. And that's the basic premise of Unix, right? So I was learning Unix hardly even knowing that I was. And that was the value of my brush with high-tech greatness in my neighborhood, right? I was kind of at the epicenter between Commodore computers, because I not only had an Amiga, I worked for Commodore, which was about 40 miles away, about a 40-minute drive out west. So in one direction to the west was Commodore computers. On the way was Norristown, Pennsylvania, where MOS Technology was, a integrated chip designer, developer, manufacturer that made the 6502 chip that the computers of the day, before the Amiga, all the home computers used. It was in like almost everything that didn't have the other knockoff, right? So there were two knockoffs of the day. No one wanted to buy the 68,000 chips from Motorola, those were in the hundreds of dollars, or the 86 or 8800 chips from Intel, which were also in the $200 or $300 range, when alternatives for like $20 or $30 were available. The knockoff of Motorola was this Norristown company called MOS, the 6502 chip. And the knockoff of Intel was the Zilog processor, the Z80, which was in everything that didn't have a 6502 chip. So this split up over the Radio Shack Coco computers and the Texas Instrument Zenith. I forget. They had different names in different countries and stuff, but there are some tablet chiclet keyboard computers that were popular in the day. They were home computers. They hardly had operating systems to speak of. In fact, a lot of times the basic programming language was loaded in as the operating system, as on the VIC-20 and Commodore 64. There's sub-stories there as well. So when the processors got more powerful, the operating systems got more formal. And the formal operating systems generally copied Unix. And there was Amiga DOS on the Amiga, and And I think there was the TOPS operating system on the Atari 520 ST, which was rushed out to compete with the Amiga under Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore, who switched to being the president of Atari once he was kicked out of Commodore. It's so colorful and wonderful and rich, these stories. During these days, you know, Commodore even had an opportunity to buy Apple for like $2 million, but they balked at that. Commodore balked at that and offered like $250,000, $250,000. And the two Steves who were sitting in front of Jack Tramiel balked at that. So again, how history could have been different on such little details. If Jack Tramiel wasn't so cheap on the counter offer on buying Apple, there would be no Apple computers today, and Commodore would be today's Apple, no doubt. So once the home computer industry kind of was like, you know, the bottom fell out of it because the video game industry was dying again, and everyone wanted PCs, PC clones, PC compatibles. It was the go-ahead to use more powerful processors. So Commodore had acquired the Amiga computer, and that came out as their higher level entry at the time, replacing some other stuff Commodore had planned, some really interesting computers they had planned. But the Amiga was based on the Motorola 60,000 chip. It got a Unix-like operating system, though it wasn't Unix, and there's also Intuition in there, which was the windowing, point-and-click operating system, made by R.J. Michael, who's still around and kicking and posting funny posts on Facebook. So shout out to all the people who made the Amiga possible, man. It was quite a kooky ensemble of characters who made a kooky computer that was 30 years at least ahead of its time. Like, it was like alien technology. Everyone thought it was going to take over the world, but Commodore was their own worst enemy and let that 30-year head start progressively slip, mostly on the altar of backwards compatibility. And I watched a video where Jay Miner, the creator of the hardware, the really special thing about the Amiga, the custom chips, because, while everyone else was like using sprinkler parts for their computers or whatever, off-the-shelf commodity stuff, Commodore, because of the Amiga and because of its ownership of MOS Technologies, was able to manufacture economically a set of custom chips that helped make the Amiga so special. There was a bunch of them: the Agnes, the Denise, the Blitter, the Copper. There's a bunch of really interesting ones in there that freed up the executive function. It's so much like the human brain. It allowed multitasking, but not just multitasking in the way we usually think of it, but multitasking between different subsystems, so that with a minimal set of instructions under the control of the central processing unit, vastly different tasks such as graphics and sound could be started on different subsystems that barely interfered with the main CPU process at all. So that's where a lot of its 30 years head start really came from. And so I'm here to talk about the operating system more than I am about the hardware. As special as the hardware was, the software was a really big step towards interoperable, standardized, commoditized software, though little did I know it. The biggest favor that was being done for me, and the biggest takeaway from my brush with Commodore greatness, was learning Unix indirectly. And it really staged me well today for this Linux world that we're in. So Linux has taken over the world, just not everybody knows it yet. And you see the strategy by these big companies, usually Microsoft, Google, and Apple, I want to say Amazon, but it's Microsoft, Google, and Amazon when you're talking about the cloud, but it's Microsoft, Google, and Apple when you're talking about changing people's daily habits through the hardware devices. The slow cooking of the frog. You put the frog in a pot, and sorry for the metaphors, I used killing two birds with one stone in one of my blog posts the other day. By the way, if you're not doing it yet, my name is Mike Levin, and my website is Mike Levin. Just put the dot before the I-N, MikeLev.in, and you'll see my blog posts. There's another one at Mike Levin SEO, MikeLevin SEO.com, and you'll see my more professional blog posts. So, not that professional, but when I think out loud to myself, just like I do in these videos, if it's on the personal front or philosophical or not directly related to my field of SEO or programming or Python or data, then it's going to be on mikelev.in. If it has anything to do with any of those other topics, it's on mikelevinseo.com or mikelevin.seo. No, mikelevinseo.com. Right? When in Philadelphia, it's Levin. When I cross that border, it becomes Levin. And I cross into New York, I'll let you know. So, I went on some interesting tangents and sub-references, and I know that talking about the three big cloud services is what, oh yeah, of course, I'm doing new stuff. Every little thing gets done. My new mantra. Just like I have my Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, capital L for Linux, capital P for Python, lowercase v for Vim, lowercase g for Git. The LPVG platform. LPVG. I now have a new mantra that's elevated right up there with Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, and also elevated with my 3 daily metaphors. Am I autistic? Yeah, maybe. Okay, someone accused me of that in one of my YouTube comments, and I thanked them very much, and then I deleted the post. So yeah, it's not that I need all my environment set up just so. It's that I appreciate the value of your body taking over for you, doing what it knows, so that your mind doesn't have to think about it. Another learning from the Amiga, it's the exact same thing as I was talking about with multitasking, if you haven't recognized the connection. The human animal is most wonderful at multitasking, because the types of things we do are fundamentally different on different levels of our brain. And yes, it's levels. And there's higher levels of your brain. The part right here under your forehead is not just your prefrontal cortex, it's your neocortex. That's right, Neo. The newest part of your brain, also probably the smallest part, is the extra little bit of wrinkly gray matter that is in our big foreheads that very few other primates or mammals or animals of any sort really share with us. Because we needed that excess capacity in order to go meta. The righteous feedback loop of self-referential thoughts. In other words, I think, therefore I am. Go to I think. It's a meta process. It's circular. It's self-referential. And lots of animals, and mammals in particular, do in fact hold a copy of their environment in their head so that they can run little simulations and kind of anticipate how things are going to turn out. That's the purpose of the brain. It's a survival thing. It's a Darwin, emergent property. Intelligence is an emergent property of evolution. Sorry, intelligent design people. So That's not to lessen the magnificentness of sentience. Executive function of the neocortex portion of your brain located under the forehead, good. It can override, for example, the fight or flight response. It can know when you actually are, you pop on cruise control so that I don't have to worry about wavering speed. Talk about multitasking. The car becomes an extension of your body, as do all tools that are particularly being held by you, that you can like feel things through, as if it was nerves and senses happened through the car. They talk about feeling the road, right? All tools work that way. You got a hammer in your hand hitting a nail. Is that not sensory input? Of course it is. Tools internalize because from the moment you make physical contact with those tools, the internalization process has begun. And that's how we've ended up with foamy extrusions as internal stilts, so that we can have vertebrae around our spinal cord and have limbs sticking out and be mobile. That extrusion, and you don't think of it, but our bones are metal. Calcium is metal. Now, it might have a lot of other stuff in there, but mostly oxygen. Oxidized metal is rust. We are made of rusty metal. Just not the red iron stuff you're used to thinking of rust, but all those, calcium carbonates and all those different things, all those different versions of calcium you hear of. Well, one version is in our bones, another version is in our teeth, another version is in the shells of clams and lobsters and shellfish, exoskeletons, and basically anything rigid in the otherwise mushy beings that we are is calcium. In some cases there's carbon in there, because carbon can become rigid, as we know from trees. But, to get carbon into a good functional rigid form, apparently it wasn't the trick our bodies used. We also passed over glass, it might be added, because when the cells are scavenging, are consuming things to eat, and then look at the things that they ingested and digested and said, can I use this, before expelling it, and silicon was totally part of that stuff. And our body said, ugh, spit that out. I don't want my bones to shatter. And it spit out a lot of stuff. It did not spit out the calcium. Calcium is like, yeah, I can use this. So internalization of tools that happened with our bones that gave us this stilts and, pincers and stuff is exactly the same as when we have the steering wheel under our hands, right? It has begun the process of internalizing the car. Maybe not like Morty and Rick and Morty, but certainly language is in that category. We have internalized language, and we have proto-languages inside of us already. The baby talk, the goo-goo gaga, mama, papa, right? These things come naturally to us, and they cut across culture sufficiently that we know that something's going on there. So language is a tool, and proto-language is in fact internalized inside of us. And all we're doing is we're releasing the final potential by being programmed up societally by our culture when we learn the nuances and details of the language of the culture that we're born into. So language is a great example of seeing external tools that get internalized, but do know that's happening all around us all the time. Now, when it happens with information tech, as it inevitably will and could be argued is actually happening now, you gotta watch your licensing. It's yet another reason why proprietary has lost and Linux won. And people are just realizing it right now. I come full circle, right? You talk enough and you get back to your original point. One may internalize Linux. Hey, I'm talking about Apple and proprietary a lot. I bought this at One Infinity Loop in the Apple Store while Steve Jobs was on campus, even though I did not see him. We joked with the bus drivers. They said, yeah, of course everyone asks that question, but it's the actual most closely guarded secret of Apple, the location of Steve Jobs at the time. I don't know, that was somewhere late 90s. I did it for Scala, which was, I graduated college, 92. Graduated high school in 88, right? If you want to date me, 51 years old. And so I did a check cashing, the effing check cashing store, as I fondly think of it, for about a year after coming out of college. My dad died on my week of graduation, great graduation gift, with very precise instructions of what he wanted. And like a fool, I followed out his instructions. I ran the business for a little while. I sold it because it was all he had. So to have any kind of inheritance, so F that, right? If you have to give up a piece of your soul and change who you are and vibe yourself differently and subject yourself to life experiences you really don't want to have, you can say F it and walk away from any amount of money. It's just not worth it. Although I did it and it helped shape who I was. So while other people were following the rise of the internet and making their billions, like Michael Rubin around the corner from me, I was running a check cashing store dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars a week, my head being swelled with how much money a humble little check cashing store could run, getting a different sense of money, saying F that, being attacked over that money in the course of doing a bank run, which you had to do every once in a while, because like an idiot, I didn't hire an armored car right away, because my dad didn't have an armored car. So, on one of these bank runs, a robber tried to hit me on the back of the head with a hammer, so boom, gun, pop, 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 4 shots, something like that. One of the shots, the 5th shot, went through a window of a place there in, I don't know, it was somewhere like Queens Village or something, somewhere in Philadelphia, near Penn's Landing area. At the time it was Mellon Bank. It's probably several banks past that since then. And, they had to bring me up. They charged me. They threw it out because I brought an army of character witnesses, explained my situation. But I shot a guy to defend myself. And boy, did that do a brain job. I probably resisted even thinking or talking about it much for about 20 years until I became quite comfortable with it. But that was my year after graduating college. Then I got into software. That was a good move, good change. But I got into software with a bunch of not so good guys. I mean, a lot of them were good. Honestly, I met some of the best people I've ever known in my life. People like Mike Sins. I mean, I knew him beforehand. These were Commodore people who moved on from Commodore when Commodore went out of business around 91 or something. I graduated in 92, so Commodore was collapsing in my last year in college. And everyone, the last rats, jumped off the ship from 91 to 92. And a number of those final rats jumped on to Scala Multimedia, later Scala Digital Signage. And even that expression I learned from someone who, when I said I was switching to Linux back in those days, he goes, oh, well, you'll have to be brushing up on your Vim skills or your VI skills, I think he said back in those days. And I'm like, F that, there's Nano or Pico, I forget which it was. There was also Sun's editor. And so in the little bit of dabbling I did on Mandrake Linux in those days, I used one of the more user-friendly, still text-based, but user-friendly text editors. And that was my second brush with VI or /VIM, because I had Fred Fish, 596 or something. The first release, I had the first release of Vim, not VI, because that was in the 1960s or, when I was a kid in the 70s. But I had the first release of Vim on the Fred Fish disc, the first popular distribution by Bram Molyneux. That was my first brush with Vim. Tony Antonuccio, the president of the Philadelphia Amiga user group at the time, really told me I should look at this. This is the big text editor on Unix. And by the way, Tony would always tell me, God bless you, Tony, that, who I'm sorry, because I think I insulted him. I saw him again while I was doing jury duty in Philadelphia. I said, while we were waiting, he walked up to me and said, "Are you Mike Levin?" I said, "Why, yes, I am. Hello, Tony." And so that's when I saw Tony Antonuccio for the second and last time after the Philadelphia Amiga user group, where I accidentally insulted him by supporting another